Good evening, and welcome to everybody who has tuned in to an evening of charm. My name's Joan Concannon, and I am the director of the York Festival of Ideas. And thank you all for joining us this evening. It is now my enormous pleasure, I've been talking to her for the last half an hour in our virtual green room, to introduce our speaker for this evening, Julia Sonnevend. Julia is Associate Professor of Sociology and Communications at the New School in New York. She is live from New York City as we speak. She is the author of Stories Without Borders, The Berlin Wall, and The Making of a Global Iconic Event. She has researched culture and democracy, as well as studying how subtle forces can be powerful, such as charm, which can influence the shape of the world and politics around us. So today she's here to discuss her new book, which is out in paperback after having a storming time as hardback. And it's called Charm, How Magnetic Personalities Shape Global Politics. Politics is a site of performance, and contemporary politicians often perform the role of a regular person, perhaps someone we would like to have a beer with, or in my case, a glass of wine. They win elections not because of the elevated rhetorical performances we often associate with charisma, but because of something more ordinary and relatable. Julia draws on themes of mass media and social media, as well as appearing authentic to draw in political tribes to explain how power is gained through charm. Julia, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you for speaking at the York Festival of Ideas.
Thank you so much for having me. And John, I agree with you on the glass of wine, much more than a beer with politicians or with anybody. Thank you so much for having me and giving me a chance to speak about my new book, Charm, How Magnetic Personalities Shape Global Politics. This is how it looks, in case people would like to see it as a physical object. The central argument or interest of this book is the question, how do we perceive politicians today, particularly on social media? And I argue that in the current era of politics, we pay much more attention to personalities than to institutions, values, and facts. This is, and I hope the slides will move. This is what we call political personalization, this obsessive focus on the personality instead of the more objective traditional forms of politics. One of the central questions of this book is the difference between charisma and charm. And when I speak about the book, people often ask me, so what is the difference between charisma and charm? Why are you using this word? And it's not an academic question necessarily. Those interested in religion might find it interesting that charisma originated in the Catholic Church. And until the 20th century, we didn't really use it about secular matters like politics. Then came German sociologist Max Weber, who argued that it's important to move charisma out of religion and into the secular realm and even discuss political authority through this vocabulary. But Max Weber spoke about charisma, this core term, in the 20th century, before the invention of television, before the rise of Hitler. We live in a radically different political environment today, and that is the core of my argument in this book, that charisma no longer really captures what we are seeing in politics. Charisma relies on distance to political citizens. Think about bombastic speeches of Churchill or Reagan, far away from the audience, capturing your attention, but in a limited set of media, and you don't feel like you are the same as the politician. The politician is, like the term charisma implies, a faraway god, not somebody you could have a beer or a glass of wine with. What we are seeing today is something radically different in politics, and that's charm, which rests on proximity to political tribes. What does that mean? So what the politician has to project is that he or she is just like us. She could be a neighbor. She could hang out with us at the playground. If you think about that, that's a very different understanding of personal magnetism than that godlike, faraway political authority. So I'm fascinated by this shift, and I often think of why the American media picked up so much of this book over the last 2 years. It has been dizzying with almost daily interviews across the American media. And I think the reason is that journalists were looking for a word. What is happening? Why do we have all these social media videos of politicians proliferating? Why would we want to see them on the subway, in their kitchen, playing with their children? And they looked for a term, and I think that's what the book provides, calling it charm, a very different understanding. So at the heart of charm is a really paradoxical situation. We are looking for authenticity in the media, right? So that's weird because when I ask people, do you trust the media? Do you believe that the media is real? Their answer is usually no, there is something manufactured in it. But when I ask them, do you want the politician to be authentic, to be relatable? Then the answer is yes. So in an environment that is manufactured, as it should be, we look for authenticity, for realness. And so there is a core contradiction and paradox there that I found interesting. Why do we want our politicians to be good at buying donuts or cooking in the kitchen? Why would that necessarily make them a better president of the United States or prime minister in the UK? So I'm going to show you a few examples of how contemporary politicians construct charm. This is an example of President Biden going to Warsaw in 2022. Before giving a speech there on the stage, he met Ukrainian refugees. He talked with children, with families, and he was quite touched by what he heard. He went on the stage with a fully written speech, and in the middle of the speech suddenly said, for God's sake, this man, namely the Russian president, cannot remain in power. It was not part of the speech, and social media exploded, and it created quite a big scandal. The White House had to put out a statement saying, no, he didn't fully mean it, and so on. But what we have seen there is the breakthrough of personality, a president who appeared as a human being for a moment, not with a scripted speech, but expressing feelings. So this is one way in which politicians today can drop their mask of being a formal politician and appear as one of us, as kind of the neighbor you could have a beer with who makes a sudden claim that was not planned. Another example I wanted to show is about restaging politics. This we have seen very often during the American presidential campaign. You basically had non-stop access to the candidates. This is Kamala Harris cooking in her kitchen, cracking the egg with one hand. So politics was no longer in the formal rooms. It's not the parliament. It's not some kind of setting like the newsroom or the press conference. You have this non-stop access to the private lives of politicians. And here the media environment matters. You might have gotten some photographs of Kennedy back then, playing with kids on the beach, but you did not have non-stop access to his private life visually. For that, we need these devices, phones we can have, in our hands and feel like we create intimacy, personal connection to politicians. Another example you might recall is when then candidate Trump was serving burgers in a McDonald's in Pennsylvania. Why would he do that, right? I mean, obviously nobody would believe that in his regular life he's serving burgers in a McDonald's, or that is in some ways his regular setting. But quite late in the campaign, the advisors realized that it's not enough to give big speeches at rallies, to give charismatic performances. He also had to appear as one of us, and that requires settings like a McDonald's and serving a burger. As absurd it looks, it worked with some audiences. My favorite example of that campaign was when Trump visited a barber shop in the Bronx, and sitting there with the people, the hairdressers and the guests, he suddenly said, "You guys are the same as me." And I was wondering, based on what metric? There is no connection. But that's what he had to project, the illusion of similarity, the connection between the audience and him. And even if you are the presidential candidate in the United States, that's the illusion that you have to provide. I also want to mention a few other international examples well beyond the United States. The book covers liberal, illiberal, authoritarian leaders, even Kim Jong-un and Viktor Orban. So there are some very unusual characters in the book. And it was quite a risky decision not to have a US case study. So you don't find Trump, you don't find Obama in the book, but you find all these international characters explaining what charm means. This is an example from New Zealand. Then Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern found a toy bunny at an airport, posted the image to Facebook and said, let's find the owner of the bunny together. I mean, it's interesting, right? It's sort of banal and everyday, but what does she do? She's creating community. There is a diverse, faceless community on so-called Facebook. And she says, let's be a community. Let's try to find that kid who is missing this toy bunny, creating this kind of illusion of relatability. She's a really interesting example. I have a full chapter on her. She was presented as the anti-Trump icon in the American context in some media outlets, particularly in the liberal or left media. And what we have seen, if you analyze, as I did, her social media, that there were continuous images of her showing her everyday life. This is an image of her a day before giving birth in the library room area, reading documents. And even in this moment that should be very private, giving birth, you have access to her in the last hours, before a very personal moment in her life. So she put basically vulnerability and mistakes and everydayness at the core of her political life. Here's another example, and it's Viktor Orbán from Hungary. Often surprises people as an example, but I thought it was important to show that charm appears across the political spectrum. You can be, on the left or you can be on the right. You use the same kind of techniques to appear as ordinary. Here he is with his wife and many grandchildren on a pink sofa. The family of Viktor Orbán is familiar to Hungarian viewers because there were regular images showing him in company of his family members. We also saw him on Facebook regularly posting images of going to food carts, ordering typical Hungarian meals, pastries, in this case a flatbread called lángos. So you don't see Orbán in the formal setting of negotiating always. There are images like that too, but you also get a sense of him as an everyday person. Another example is almost reminding one on the Obama image of change, we can believe in. In this case, he's at a pig slaughtering on the countryside with a dead pig in front of him. Again, a highly unusual representation. Another examples from the Facebook. He's carrying up a stroller. He is diapering his grandchild. And it's not direct political messaging if you look at it, but there is some political messaging. With the diaper image, he's posting, don't worry, I will give you back to your mom. So I'm doing this for a moment, but it is the role of the woman to do so. So there is messaging, political messaging behind it, but it's a very kind of everyday personal understanding. And here is the new Prime Minister of Hungary, Péter Magyar, who had a very personality-based campaign throughout. If you look up his Facebook, almost all posts include an image of him. So if you paid attention to him during this short period of 2 years of the campaign, you got a sense of the sports he likes, the everyday activities, the hobbies, his favorite food. We saw him again cook in his kitchen, travel. We got a sense of his fashion choices, his friends, the concerts he likes to attend, and so on. I know probably much more about him as a person than I know about his policies or related institutions. It's really a personality-based campaign. But if you think of the challenges he faced, he was facing a much older opponent who had access to a wide variety of media and much more financial resources to run a campaign. What helped Péter Magyar with this personality-based campaign that with relatively limited resources and focusing on social media, he could counter a much more powerful campaign. Just by presenting a dynamic, relatable character throughout. So over time for Hungarians, it really became a question, is it Viktor Orbán or is it Péter Magyar? It's less about the policies that each of them proposed, and more about can you relate to the person on an individual level. Most likely in your life, you will not meet politicians in person, but they give you the illusion that you know them very well to a level that you even understand their private life or can comment on that. I also want to spend just a moment on the question of charm offensive. So you can have charm continuously and you can weaponize charm for a short-term goal that you want to achieve. Let's say you want to sign a deal or you want to have a successful Olympics in your country. You might give more access to people during that time, so to your personal life, so that you can get that political deal done. One example that I'm analyzing in the book is a big deal between the United States and Iran in 2015, which was about nuclear matters. And it really helped that the American press showed it as a personal matter between politicians of that time instead of a complex nuclear deal negotiation. So you saw images of the Iranian foreign minister with the US Secretary of State taking walks, laughing together, having these charming moments. And that's how the American press created an environment in which ultimately President Obama was able to sign the deal. It wasn't about adversaries, it was about human beings connecting with each other. So we had seen many of these images of leaders of Iran and the United States bonding in that moment. Another example that I'm analyzing in the book is Kim Jong-un, who wanted a successful Korean Olympics. So he suddenly took selfies and allowed the media into his life much more than he has ever done before. He even took images with the South Korean president together, which rocked social media nationally and internationally. So finally, I want to give a counter case to you. You might ask me, do all politicians have to be charming? Is there an example when somebody is not charming and still successful? And I have the example of Angela Merkel in my book. So what you see on the screen is Angela Merkel's Instagram. It's my favorite slide. What is changing? It's basically the color of the jacket, right? And then who do you see? You see Angela Merkel being herself. She's giving complex pieces of information, details, in this case, during the pandemic as a scientist. But you don't really get a sense of, the hobbies of Angela Merkel or everyday details of her private life. Now, the team tried to show her as charming on Instagram. On the left side, you see a picture with Theresa May of their shoes. It's really a bit of a joke on femininity and what they enjoy wearing. And on the right side, you see an image of her naming a newborn calf at a farm in Germany. And it's a bit awkward. She looks like she's coming from a top EU meeting, but she's happened to be in a farm. So there's a kind of disconnect. So thank God early on, I believe the team realized that it's better to let Angela Merkel be herself than to present her in Instagram ways. So instead of Instagramizing Angela Merkel, they let Merkel turn Instagram into a space of her kind of Merkelized Instagram. So you saw these very formal settings and videos of Angela Merkel just, being her regular self, and somehow it did not harm her image. What it shows to us that charm dominates contemporary politics, but it's not everywhere. I also wanted to mention that it has risks, and we could discuss in the Q&A. I believe it is on a spectrum between seduction and deception. If it works, if the politician charms you, it's like seduction in the best sense. Think Don Giovanni. You feel, it's like love. It's, you're flying high. But if it's, falls apart, if the performance fails, then you feel truly deceived, and then it creates a very big distance. And with the frequency with which we receive videos and images of politicians, the risk is very high. Even if you're very good at charm, you post so much these days as a politician, most of the time it's your team who is posting it, that the risk of failure is very much there. With every new post, there is another moment of risk. So in this process and in this life in which we have the continuous videos and images out there of politicians, it's quite likely that you have a moment of cringe. I want to mention this because the book includes a section on the feeling of cringe or the presentation of cringe, and that came from my undergraduate students. I teach in New York City. At the new school, I always assign my work before publication to undergraduate students who are 18 or 19 or 20. And those of you who have kids of that age know that they will directly tell you if you are wrong on anything. So the student wrote me an email to me and said, Professor Sonnevend, this is all great and good, and I enjoyed the book, but you did not talk about cringe, the situation, right? When it doesn't work, when it's just awkward. And I said, oh my God, the book is almost in production with the press. What should I do? So I frantically emailed. And if you read the book, you will see there is a paragraph in the introduction that doesn't fit, which is about cringe. And that's because that student recommended it to me, and I'm so thankful to her that she did so. Because yes, as you scroll on your phones, right, you often feel like, okay, this worked, or this is really awkward, this is not good. So every moment when we open up our social media, we make these evaluations. Did it charm us? Did it not charm us? You may not use these terms, but that's how you feel. So I believe that charm is a key word of contemporary politics. It doesn't mean that it's the only word that we use about politics. It doesn't mean that every single politician we encounter is charming, but it means that it's a key factor in how we look at contemporary political affairs. And I do believe that if we don't consider it, we are missing a crucial aspect. What does this mean for our contemporary politics? It means a very volatile environment. Politics being turned into performance can have positive effects. I don't think it's charm is either good or bad. It can mobilize people, it can create new solidarities, it can make you feel connected to politics. Let's be honest, a lot of people feel disillusioned, disconnected, so they look for something that energizes them. And that's what we have seen internationally, from country to country, that if you have a charming, charismatic character, often combining both charm and charisma, then that person can really energize people. We have seen this in New York, we have seen this in Budapest and across the world. But at the same time, it's worth noting that this focus on personality also means that we have a very volatile, very risky political environment. We may have these new political leaders kind of popping up and then disappearing in a minute. Some of the characters in my book are no longer in politics, partly because this kind of focus on your personality really burns you out. It's very hard to maintain. All of you who are on social media know how terribly tiring it is to present that most beautiful selves all the time. And here they have to show both their most beautiful selves and their vulnerable selves and their private lives in every aspect, and nothing is free from politics anymore. So I believe it has both the seductive part, it has both the deceptive part, and we need to pay attention to charm if you want to understand contemporary politics in the United States and internationally. Thank you. I know it was a little shorter than we planned, but that's okay. We have more time for questions.
Exactly so. Julia, that was absolutely fascinating. As somebody who's a complete nerd about the fascination of politics and the bravery, audacity, and sometimes naked ambition of politicians, that was a really interesting take on what motivates the political environment and the kind of new tools that politicians use to get themselves noticed. Was there a particular politician or a particular action that made you coalesce this particular really fascinating depiction of charm versus charisma? Or was it a kind of agglomeration effect of so much political volatility and feel? What was the kind of moment where you thought, there's a book about charm here?
It's a great question. Initially, I thought that I would write a book about charm in every parts of life, how it is in our private lives, in entertainment, in the media, and then in politics. But that proved to be just too big to tackle. But I think the initial influence was this feeling that we don't talk enough about the power of charm. If you are a social scientist like me, social scientists freak out from topics like charisma and charm because you cannot control it. We like defining things, quantifying things, controlling things. The charm you cannot control. So any reasonable social scientist runs away from a topic like this because it's right, like because it's oh my God, what will I do? It will not. And a bunch of people pushed me to have a clear definition of charm, and it has a definition in the book, but I kept saying, it's the magic. You can't define magic. It's like touching a butterfly. You kill it. You can't define everything. You can't put a straitjacket on everything. And we academics are terrible at this, attitude of really controlling whatever we can. So I had to let that go. And I said, we need a book on this issue. And it also meant for me just thinking through what is the power of this quality. And a last point on that, I also noticed, particularly in the US, a lot of suspicion around charm. Like you mentioned to people in the grocery store, let's say, what do you work on? I say, I work on charm. Then I often get the reaction of, well, that's fascinating, but I have to tell you, I don't trust charming people. Like such a typical sentence I get. So I find it so interesting because on the one hand, I mean, who doesn't want to be seduced, right? I mean, we all like charming people in everyday life. At the same time, it's very important to know that no, I'm not trusting them. I'm suspicious of them. So it's like we have to be critical nonstop.
So I guess it's the understanding of charm that is verging on, to use your students' depiction, cringy and inauthentic because it's facile or somehow superficial, relative to people who think particular kinds of charm are very relatable and that they understand, they have a feeling that they are understood and that somebody understands their circumstances. And I guess the particular appeal, if you are already feeling alienated and you're already feeling you have been impacted by others clearly gaining a value or gaining advantage, that somebody comes along and in a very relatable way seduces you into their aura because you think that they care about you, without thinking about what's in it for them. And I guess that
That
possibly
may
is.
be the suspicion aspect. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think it's very understandable, and it also is related to magic, and something you may not be able to fully control in your everyday life. We all want to feel like we are leading, right? And then there are these aspects, but I often think about it in such a way that some of the best parts of life are exactly those that are hard to define or that are uncontrollable. It's love, it's luck, it's hope, it's charm, right? And we often don't forget about them because it's sort of fashionable to be critical of everything.
Mhm.
And it's the coolness factor. I think particularly in academia, you have to be very cool or nonstop, so you have to be super critical. But then there are these important aspects of life, and they do bring hope. I also believe in the case of charm that we see a radical shift in politics, and as hard it is for me as a media scholar to say, is the media? We are very careful with that, and in media research to say, oh, the media is causing it. But in this particular case, I do believe that the ability to push content out non-stop and to have video recording that we regulars could also take up politicians. You run into the politician in a cafe, you can record it. It's a very different media environment. And then going to bed, you scroll, and you see Mom Danny, you see, Peter Magyar, you see Trump, and so on. So you feel like you know them,
Yeah.
but it is ultimately a projected illusion.
So before we go to the audience questions, I can see some absolute corkers. One final question for me for now, at least, is you obviously have your case studies and they cover quite a spectrum of, the autocratic, the illiberal, the authoritarian, the kind of the kindness factor, I guess, with Jacinda Ardern. Were there others? How did you get down to those five? And were there others that just missed the mark, as it were, and that you now kind of go, oh, I wish I'd done whoever. I mean, for instance, I guess there's two females and three men. were there other women that you thought about, Georgia Maloney or uh, others that you feel that you had been fascinated by, but you had to get it down to a reasonable number?
Georgia Maloney would be a really interesting case. I mean,
Mm,
from fashion to the way of charming, really a very wide variety of political leaders internationally. She would be an excellent case study. These were all kind of researched peer-reviewed journal article first before they reached. So I wrote this for the general audience, but
yeah.
they had this kind of research cases beforehand. Um, I don't think that was quite clear at the beginning that I wanted to have a variety. I wanted to make the claim that it's not a leftist thing. It's not a
Mhm.
conservative thing. This is across the spectrum. And I also wanted to shock the audience a little bit with a few examples, like Kim Jong-un wouldn't be
Yeah.
your, immediate example, probably.
That was the one that shocked me. I was thinking he had a moment where he was charming. Wow, I hadn't spotted that.
There is that element, or well-established prime ministers. You would
Mm,
think that there is this kind of moment, and I was a little frustrated by the coverage, often in the United States, particularly of international politicians. I felt that it was a little two-dimensional. So if let's say if you show Viktor Orban, it was only through the language of authoritarianism. I'm not questioning that, but you see only one side. And you
yeah.
don't get the understanding that on Facebook he has these pictures of going to the food cart. So for the local appeal of why he won 4 elections with two-third majority, you had to understand the local appeal. And
Mhm.
I wanted to show that aspect in each case, and that even in non-liberal contexts, or even in authoritarian or illiberal contexts, you have the power of charm. So it's kind of transcends those boundaries.
So let me move on to our first question. Fiona asks, charm is attractive and immediate. How do we instill a dose of critical thinking into the collective public consciousness when people want instant gratification?
That's an excellent question, right? And I sure we think about it ourselves too. I teach my students. I teach media at the new school, as I said, to undergraduates, but also to graduate students, PhD students. And I often say, just take a few minutes before you respond on social media. It will not hurt anybody, right? If you wait 5 seconds, 10 seconds, because the pressure is so high for this
Mhm.
immediate response. And I do believe it brings out often the worst from all of us. That's just how it is designed. And even as an academic, I have to regularly post and show both the personal and the professional. So I do think about this question in such a way. What I was trying to show with this book, that there are tools that politicians use internationally. And if you read the book, you can detect those tools in each case. And I think that equips you with a form of critical thinking. That doesn't mean you have to dismiss charm as a tool. So let's say a politician is showing a video with playing with kids in an elementary school as he's introducing his new policy on childcare or preschools. That's not necessarily bad. You watch the video, you get a sense of the policy. But then there are also ways in which it can really get weaponized. And so what I was trying to show in the book, that it can be used for both seduction and deception. You have to understand the tools to detect and decide, yourself.
Well, that segues very nicely, Julia, into the next question from Imogen. To what extent do you think social media algorithms have impacted how charmed an audience is to individual politicians? How much is part of the seduction that the social media algorithms themselves? Because I guess the relationship now between a certain very small number of tech bro oligarchs
Mm-hmm.
and certain leaders of very large nations is quite an interesting construct by itself. So how much can we trust any of this when so much of our lives are dominated by quite murky constructs that sit under the social media platforms?
That's again an excellent question. You have a wonderful audience here. I really enjoy
Always.
the quality of the question. So, I design new courses at the new school on the topic of propaganda. I call it in such a way, but basically it's about this question. And I did so because I saw an increasing number of students who were really concerned about the amount of content and one-sided content that was pushed towards them through an algorithm. And I see particularly the risk with very young students just receiving one viewpoint over and over amplified by the algorithm, making them less and less able to interact with diverse viewpoints. And ultimately, college is about that. You meet people you don't agree with, and you have to deal with it. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what we do. We can't protect, and I don't think we should protect anybody from that experience. Quite the contrary, you should meet people you disagree with. But the algorithmic culture means that, and this personality-focused politics, that so once you start liking a political character, you will get more of the images, more of the videos, and you will see less of the possible variety. And
Mm.
I do worry in that sense about that political culture and the chance for political violence as we less and less engage with variety and diversity in perspectives.
Well, it's certainly a reason why we set up the Festival of Ideas in 2011 was the idea of bringing diversity of opinions, experiences, perspectives into a safe environment. So there's a very interesting question here on how much, from ETA, how much can charm be manufactured? For instance, Orban emulating Putin's control of the media ecosystem to position himself as this macho guardian of Hungary's identity and culture, while at the same time also using Putin's very effective tropes around Russia or Hungary as the victim of Western interference, the EU, and global elites. How much do you think that idea of surface charm and that kind of, the picture of the pig really reminds
Mhm.
me of that famous photograph of Putin without his top on, in the hunting in the middle of the Russian steppes. Those kind of particular images constructed to make you feel that they are the guardians of a national identity.
That's crucial. And one of the things I like about giving talks internationally, that it is much harder, at least in the United States, to make people aware of the Russian disinformation campaigns and foreign influence that is present. I think people are much more aware in Europe of this kind of very targeted and clear communication tools that once you pay attention are actually quite repetitive. So you see certain Russian political communication tools repeated in Hungary, such as showing the political leader as a mafia leader, as a kind of godfather. That, I get very often that question, why was Viktor Orban presented in such a way? I mean, one would never know why, but there was a very clear Russian previous example doing exactly that. So what we see is also this kind of international repetition and copying. And since the political communication advisors, are often in communication with each other across the borders, you also have a repetition going on, even across political lines. But it's quite interesting to watch it that way. I mean, in terms of manufacturing, I mean, in some ways, these professional political images are all manufactured since political communication teams are behind them, even the ones we agree with, and also the ones we disagree with, are produced by professional teams. The question is ultimately, does it represent the actual political aims of the political party? Does it allow diversity of opinions? Can you disagree with it? Is it pushed towards you from every conceivable media channel? So one example I mentioned about this, that when I used to visit Hungary during the Orbán government, you walk around in Budapest and you see these big government posters. So you walk with your kid, in my case, and my child is asking regularly questions. Why is this up there? Why one is supposed to hate George Soros? And you have to answer it. So you cannot escape the media sphere. And that is a concern to me, particularly.
Yeah, I saw that those pictures in your book, and it was very, very striking. So somebody who hasn't given their name, but nonetheless, thank you for the question. I may have to explain a particularly bizarre show that we have over here, Julia. So, but the question does quite a good job.
Share
So,
it with me. I can't
uh,
wait to hear it.
brace yourself. In the UK, far-right leader Nigel Farage was allowed to join a British reality show called I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, which shows celebrities in the jungle surviving the best they can. They have to do the most disgusting, horrible things, eating terrible things, going into pits with, various animals and all that kind of thing. And the questioner says, I think this hugely contributed to his charm, as you say. Should this not be illegal? It feels completely corrupt that I guess politicians have the ability to kind of harness those kind of media platforms to present themselves in a particular way. But obviously that is an opinion of the reader. But I guess the
Mhm.
guts of the question about how far should we allow political systems and political operators within those systems to be able to galvanize their particular media messaging around those kind of platforms? Is it controllable at all?
I mean, that is a very powerful and kind of $1 million question on how to do it well, right?
Allegedly, he was paid quite a lot of money to be on it.
Yeah, and then you are, in many cases also dealing with, as you mentioned, international platforms under very little regulation. So, I mean, I think there are two approaches. One I would certainly like to see is more regulation of the platforms, because there are certain practices that they can control. And there is no amount of media literacy I can teach at the university to the students if they allow certain practices to proliferate. So I can't compete with that level of power, even as a media educator for now 20 years. Um, but in terms of the politicians and the ability to control their manipulation, that is a quite difficult question. I think if it's a free media environment where you can have at least a variety of viewpoints being present, then you can play around and create your own sympathies. I am very concerned about media environments where governments control huge number of news outlets directly or indirectly through business means. And then that kind of playing around with ideas basically cannot happen. But on a fundamental level, and that's why I'm still in academia, I do think that we have to teach very deep media literacy very early on, dealing with particularly the algorithmic environments and the risk of leaving nuanced discourse behind. It's very easy to just say your own opinion. We started actually a new center at the new school dedicated to nuanced discourse exactly because of the desire to keep that core of academia intact, that you have a variety of perspectives being present, and then you find your relationship to it. But what I see and hear from my students actually quite often that there are less and less spaces they can do that. And they feel more and more kind of pressure to have an opinion about everything. You don't know about something, you still have to have an opinion. You have to, change your profile picture. You have to comment on it. Otherwise, you're uncool. So that kind of pressure we also have to remove. And I often tell my students, it's okay to say in my class, I don't know. we
Yes.
don't have to we don't have to form an opinion about everything in life. It's okay to just sit back and occasionally listen.
Yeah, listening I think is good. I mean, it's interesting. I find the constant narratives about the uselessness of studying media a sort of interesting construct when it is so all pervasive. It's one of the most pervasive influences that most people have in their lives, and yet there is this constant kind of idea that it's a complete waste of time spending time studying such a powerful medium. I mean, I
That
guess,
it's like Disneyland, right? It's not
yeah,
serious
yeah.
work. It's still some of the top universities of the world don't have a media or communications department, which I find absurd. It's there in politics, it's there in everyday life. Our children, are struggling to kind of find their connections. I have an 8-year-old, so we don't yet have a cell phone. Fortunately, then I'm already dreading that moment when I will have to navigate that landscape. Last point on that, since I'm raising a child in the United States, one of the things I often observe that there is a very strong education, particularly here, that everybody has to speak, everybody has to have a voice, and I often say to him that listening is equally important. We cannot have a world in which everybody nonstop speaks. Somebody has to occasionally listen and weigh
Well,
the facts.
certainly leads to a lot of white noise. There's a very interesting question here that I think is you touched on it before, but I think the way this question is framed is really interesting. Is the appeal of charm universal, or are the populations of certain countries more susceptible? Going back to the outlier in your quintet of Angela Merkel, I guess you would say that Friedrich Merz is not necessarily it's not somebody I necessarily think about as an uber charmer. Is there a particular kind of pattern of particular either political systems or cultures that seem more susceptible to the idea of charm?
Wonderful question. And one of the reasons I have detailed case studies
Mm.
in the book, and each chapter is one character, because I didn't want it to be superficial and glib in that sense of, oh, it's just everywhere the same.
Yeah.
Because there is history, there is culture, there are stories, there are tropes, and so on. And I think Germany, I will not be able to prove this empirically easily, but I do think it's a very strong factor that Germany had a very negative experience with charisma through Hitler. So it's an inbuilt worry. That much polls also show about the German public that there is a very strong suspicion towards charismatic performances. I think it's not an accident, and in that environment, you may not look necessarily for a charming character. The experience of the Holocaust is very strongly present and resonates. Um, I do think it's culturally specific beyond the case of Germany as well. Some countries might have strong authoritarian figure traditions and connect more to that messaging. You have to look at the local to understand it.
Mm, that's interesting. The so there was a question on just um Fiona again. How do you think charm contributes to the paradox that people seem to fall in love with certain politicians, yet fail to hear and understand that their policies will actually negatively impact upon them?
Such a fascinating question,
It's such
right?
a cult of
Yeah.
the personality idea.
And so many times it's the case that people would show that is against their interests, right? So
Mm,
we were, raised with the message that, oh, if people have bad schools and bad hospitals and the roads are not okay, then they will vote against the government. But we have seen repeatedly internationally in many contexts that you can have, crumbling infrastructure and horrible, public school system, and still they vote in the government one more time. And so that's where political communication matters.
mm,
If the narrative, if the mythology resonates, the facts don't really matter. I
mm.
have a piece I once wrote, which is about facts never win over mythologies, and that's what I believe. If you have a strong story, that will always win over any kind of fact checking. You might recall we used to have this fact checking going
Yes.
on the screens. The American president speaks, and oh, he's not true. This is not true. That's a lie. Whatever. Nobody cared. As long as it's the power of the story being there. I mean, I don't think that's necessarily a positive thing at all, but it is the reality we live in.
Yeah, it's sort of my observation, it's a personal opinion, is the power of the story didn't seem to matter that blatantly some of those stories could not empirically be true, but somehow there was an attractiveness in wishing that such a story was true that made people almost price in the idea that it might not be true, but it was still an attractive idea that they were that appealed to them.
hmm I mean, think about even slogans like "Make America Great Again"
Mhm.
or "Drain the Swamp" or "Let's Build a Wall," "Make Mexico Pay for It." It's not so much about the details of it. It's the power of the mythology. You would
Yeah.
say there used to be a beautiful country. We lost it. We have to get it back. It is powerful because of its lack of specificity. If it said it was, like that in 1951, people could argue with it. No, it wasn't. It didn't have the rights for women in the same way, and so on. But since it's a mythological imagined past, it is easy to relate to it.
So there's an interesting differential that you highlight, particularly around Jacinda Ardern, which is the way that she was viewed in New Zealand, was very much, and the framing was very much taken as her portraying her vulnerabilities and her challenges. Whereas certainly from our perspective here in the UK, and particularly after the horrific events in New Zealand, it was her empathy and her appeal for calm and for understanding that really resonated with global audiences that led to this rhetoric of her being the anti-Trump. And I wondered if you had a kind of thought about the different perceptions that the use of this kind of charming framework has between how a national audience will view you and how you appeal on a global stage.
So that's really interesting with politicians, the difference between the local perception and the global in that sense. But I agree with you. I looked at that particular case as well of how she embraced the Muslim community after that horrific attack um, on two mosques, and her hugging members of the community really communicated immediately a message of kindness, not just nationally but also internationally, and it mattered in that moment
Mm.
particularly. So it's multiple layers, but at the same time, you had also her regular Facebook posts showing Jacinda Ardern struggling with managing both work and being a new mother. You see her sitting next to a diaper pail while she's, on phone with one of the leaders in international politics. So it was important for her to show both the kindness and this kind of vulnerability. She sometimes used the wrong camera function. There were some issues with some of the posts. So she liked mentioning those. That's a very non-macho representation. You don't have to be perfect and strong and so on. And it somehow worked. But it's also important to know that she's no longer in politics. So this
Hmm.
kind of vulnerability and presenting your everydayness can easily lead to burnout, and it's worth noting that a lot of people were also critical about her politics or about her and so on, and so it ended up being a very tension-filled environment and anything but kindness at the end.
Yes, it did. And I guess that dichotomy in so much of what you're talking about in your book, that idea of being exceptional but familiar, genuine but media savvy, and all within a landscape powered by metrics, money and emotion and attention, is such a fascinating way to grapple with this rise of a very different kind of a popularity contest for politicians. Where ultimately do you think is the the biggest challenge or the biggest thing we should be concerned about in this new media environment where politicians, either for their own purposes or because they feel compelled to put on a particular kind of show, how much should we worry about where this might end up?
I think we should worry reasonably, while also seeing the positive sides of, energizing communities and creating new forms of solidarity. But if you think through these elements, so there are the metrics, there are the algorithms, there is a continuous presence demanded, and then there is our individual desire for connection, for understanding each other, for seeing another human being. I had
Mm,
a party in this apartment yesterday about this new edition of Charm, and it struck me how important it was to meet people in person instead of Zoom and online and so on. Just the power of, having a glass of wine with somebody and
mm,
discussing the book in such a way. So that desire is in us as human beings, but the media environment will be less and less about, authentic personal connection. So the challenge will be how to keep the best part of charm, namely that we might connect to politics, we might pay more attention to it, we might consider, or, particularly young people could relate more because they have this version of connection. But we should also be careful and be wary of the rapid change that is inbuilt, the volatility of, you
mm.
have it's basically theater. You have the new performer coming and then he leaves, and another one, and then she leaves. And, how can we keep our humanity intact in that all is a big question.
Well, I think that's a question that it sets us up rather beautifully. And I truly wish you were here in person because you would be an amazing addition to a focus day we're running next Sunday for anyone who's in the UK, which is essentially using a courtroom framework to put democracy on trial with an array of speakers. But one of our fundamental questions is, are democratic systems as they currently exist capable of navigating 21st century challenges and technologies? But we're
Wow,
also
so good.
very much leaning into the how can humanity control and govern such rapidly changing, powerful technology platforms, and where is the hope that we can kind of engender among ourselves to make humans feel in the ascendancy again. So for anyone who's watching from the UK, you are very welcome to come to York. And I think, Julia, we need to ensure we are on your mind the next time you're traveling internationally and that you can come visit us all in York at the York Festival of Ideas. We are pretty
I would
much
love
at,
to do that.
it would be
Thank you. And I
wonderful.
would also attend this event. So
It was
do
so
it.
well, it will also be filmed and online. So we will juxtapose this event with the three sessions we're running on Sunday, the 7th of June, because I think there is so much common ground in the work that you have done, this really important work of getting us to think differently about how we engage, believe, and relate to politicians and what they tell us and how they tell us. I think is just an utterly fascinating thing. So thank you so much for tuning in from New York today. Hope to see you in York again on another occasion. But for now, thank you to everybody in our audience for tuning in. We will let everybody know when this recording is available on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to buy Julia's book. It is absolutely fascinating and it's a great read. And it's for sale with our booksellers, Fox Lane Books. Julia, have a lovely rest of the day
Thank
in
you
lovely
so
New
much.
York. And we will hopefully see you sometime soon in York. Thank you so much to you
Let's
for
do
such
that.
fascinating talk.